Economic Development Partnership, and she had coordinated with the Chamber and the Downtown Development Authority to gather us all together to sort of talk about what we as landlords and tenants and specifically the panelists as brokers were experiencing, watching, and thought that sharing our experiences with you would help you be a guide with regard to what are next steps. I think there is no playbook for what we're experiencing. I think we're sort of inventing the solutions on the run. And I think they're based on, formulating reasonableness, trying to find fairness between what is needed to survive from a company's perspective and also from a landlord's perspective. So we'll start off with introducing myself. I'm Scott Reichenberg. I'm the president and CEO of the Colorado Group. I'm joined by three panelists. Probably between the four of us, we have about a little over 80 years of experience in the marketplace. I don't think any of us would suggest to you today we've seen this before. I think there's a few things that may mimic it a little bit with regard to the Great Recession, the tech bust in 2000, but probably nothing that any of us have directly seen. So with that, I think what we're going to do, each panelist is going to kind of take a different perspective. We're going to talk about from the tenant's perspective, we're going to talk about from the landlord's perspective, and then we're going to do a little bit of looking into the future. What do the next few months look like for each of us? But before we dive in, probably need to discuss a couple of, not ground rules, but the way this webinar is set up. Today's presentation is being recorded. So if you have some peers or others that you want to share this with, Wendy can make it available as far as a link to the website. We are going to hold firm to the hour long discussion today, and the panelists are probably going to make an opening statement for 3 to 4 minutes, and then we're really going to field a bunch of questions. So we would encourage each of you to go to the bottom of your screen at the chat function and enter in any questions that come up during anyone's sort of general comments, and then we'll sort of address those one by one. If we bump up against the hour-long deadline, we'll probably wrap up the formal part of this, but we invite all of you to maybe stay for another 10 or 15 minutes as we field some follow-up questions. We will have some contact information at the end of the last slide that will allow you to reach out to any of us if you have follow-up questions that's specific to you. But I think what you're going to find, there is not one shoe fits all here as far as a solution. It's really about evaluating all of the dynamics of everyone's situation. And we'll go through some of those examples on today's conversation. Let me check my notes and make sure I mentioned everything that I wanted to before we dive in here. So with that, I think we're ready to sort of kick off the conversation. The first panelist, I don't know if we have that slide. There we go, is Ashley. Ashley's going to be talking from a perspective of the tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ashley, let him make some general comments, and then we'll take some questions specific to tenants. Ashley?
Thanks, Scott. My name is Ashley Overton. I'm a commercial real estate broker who has survived 9/11, the dot-com bust, the Great Recession, and my dad telling me how the S&L crisis was worse than all of those. But I think with what's going on now, I might have him beat. He's retired, so I'll let him know about it from here on out. So a curveball was thrown at me a couple of hours ago when I found out that the PPP and EIDL loans were the well had run dry. And so they're no longer taking applications on those. And that was about half of what the talking points I had to discuss today. So what you see on the slide there is that those two programs are now to be determined. There is hopefully going to be an additional $250 billion allocated to the program, but Nancy and Donald have to figure things out before that is achieved. But chances are it will be back. And the PPP loan, if you haven't already gotten into that yourselves, what I recommend with preparation for when it does open up again is just have your tax returns ready, particularly the payroll tax forms that are appropriate for whether or not you're an S corp or independent contractor, et cetera. You have those in order. That's what the lenders, those that are going to be accepting applications, will want. The EIDL loans, as I said, were supposed to be an interim bit of relief that you could roll into the PPP, and you'll ultimately talk to your SBA lender about how you do that. If you do have a relationship with an SBA lender, you do have some additional options at this point. And I scrambled to have to find some of these less obvious programs, but there are some additional programs out there. And as I said, if you have an SBA lender you've been working with, you'll want to talk to them about what's called the Small Business Debt Relief Program. That's for current 7A and 504 loans. And supposedly, and I'm not too sure about whether or not this comes from the same well as the other funding was, but the SBA is supposed to cover principal, interest, and fees for the next 6 months related to existing SBA loans. Moving along, there's also what's called the Express Bridge loans. This is also via an SBA lender relationship. And this is a $25,000 supplement to the PPP and EIDL loans. And as the name suggests, it was supposed to be a bridge. You're supposed to be able to achieve it quickly within 45 days, I think was the objective. We know how that goes with this program, but you should talk to your lender if you have an SBA lender to work with about that program. Now, immediate things that you could do are what would be the employee retention tax credit. And this is getting more into a conversation to have with your accountant, but nevertheless, as I was saying, I just wanted to touch on some other programs, some relief that tenants have at their disposal. And so the payroll tax credit is it defers Social Security tax. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. But the employee retention tax credit is an immediate credit to amount of payroll taxes employers can withhold from their employees' pay stub, from their check. And so that is an immediate credit. Deferral program they have is the payroll tax deferral, and that defers Social Security for up to 2 years. Now it's a deferment. It means you got to pay it back over the course of 2 years. And then if all else fails, or if you're looking for other resources, I suggest talking to the Colorado Small Business Development Center. They do have leads or sources for small business alternative funding. And there's dozens of options. It's, of course, loans. And so it works like a loan, these other sources. And so it won't be as attractive as the PPP in the sense that none of it will be relieved. So that being said, pardon me, I want to talk about rent relief strategies, because that is, of course, what we're all dealing with right now. And rent, it's a tricky thing to deal with because, well, first of all, without tenants, we don't have a real estate industry. And so we need to find a way to get our tenants through this period of time. And landlords were, of course, leaning on the SBA programs to get us through the next couple of months, because those loans, of course, would cover payroll and rent. But since those are dried up, what do? Well, it's not like we wouldn't negotiate with our landlord to begin with, but we have to put an emphasis on it now. And so what you'll be dealing with here is hopefully a landlord that's willing to discuss options with you. And if your landlord hasn't already reached out to you, you need to contact them. And for my tenant clients, I've found that the most logical or successful path to results is to call the landlord and email them. And that means specifically you, the tenant, the business owner, not your broker, not your attorney, you. You should call the landlord. You should explain your situation. Now, if your landlord's playing ball, and they should, you should be discussing about rent abatement or deferment. Abatement is what it is. It would sometimes include pushing out your lease term a bit, but with the objective of giving you an abatement period for the upcoming X amount of months. And then there's various ways to negotiate it and lots of moving parts, how you end up with the results of what will be an amendment to your lease. And at that point, you'll definitely want to get your attorney to review the amendment. And you should probably talk to your broker prior to then to just run the deal points, someone to run the deal points by, make sure that it's, I guess we'll call it market for these unprecedented times. And so it's yet to be determined what that really means, but we can give you a good sense as a broker to our tenant clients whether or not we're on the right track or not. Deferment, just bouncing back a bit, is what it is. The landlord would say, okay, we'll give you some relief right now, but you're going to pay it back in the end. Where you're either going to amortize it on top of the lease rate going forward, or you got to pay it in a balloon sort of situation. Obviously, the abatement structure is more desirable. And then documentation, again, the amendment that will accompany the lease that memorializes this agreement. You'll want to, again, get your attorney to look at that. All right, so if you were preparing for the PPP, you probably knew already that you need to have your finances in order. So this also segues into your discussions with your landlord. You should have a budget. You should predict, you should forecast what your income stream is going to look like, payroll, rent, everything for the next at least 10 months through the end of the year, we'll say. Because your landlord's probably going to want your business financials. They want to see what you've been doing, what you expect to do. They might need to discuss this situation with their lender, and the lender might want to see this information. So be prepared for that. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to submit that information. They might even want you to, they being the landlord, will probably want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that the terms of the deal you made with them aren't discussed from one tenant to the next. Because you know what? Every deal or every negotiation is separate based on the tenant circumstances. And so that's why they would ask you to do that. Again, perfectly appropriate to, at the end of the day, not discuss it. I think that what you will need to do with that NDA is get something in there to say, with the exception of, go to your attorney, of course, to look at this NDA, with the exception of being able to run these deal terms by financial advisors, et cetera. And then the last part to this is when you submit your financials and you talk to your landlord prior to talking to your landlord and sending them that email, you want to have a clear objective of what you're after. Do you need to abate rent for a period of time? How long? Do you need to defer rent for a period of time? How long? How much? I mean, you want to present a real story. You don't want to just lob a number. You want to be able to express the intent in a way that the landlord is going to say, you've done your homework and I'm ready to help you out. Because ultimately they do want to help you out. They need you. And well, without you, they're going to have a hard time paying the mortgage, and it's just not going to work well for anybody. So, but be diplomatic about it, and just keep your head on straight, and I think you'll get through it. Like I said, I've been through this before. This is crazy times, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. I keep one eye on CNBC. I keep one eye on the Journal, and from all angles, it seems like, yes, this is going to hurt. It's going to last longer than probably anyone expected. But as long as we keep businesses afloat and landlords are playing ball, we'll get through it.
So actually, let me jump in here. I think you've done a nice job of kind of running down the laundry list of things that are options to our tenants and some basic framework. But I think the meat and potatoes of this is really getting into what are we seeing? What are landlords and tenants agreeing to? Or really specifically, what are tenants asking for and why? I think knowing what you want to ask for, but being able to justify it so the landlord feels, I think, as if he's been fairly treated with regard to how is he helping you. So, we won't talk about very specific deals for confidentiality, but I think mentioning kind of the framework of where on one side of the spectrum we've seen, nominal asks, but asks, and then more aggressive asks, and what's been accomplished. I think that's what everyone in the audience really wants to understand, which is what should their expectations be?
Right, Scott. Well, most landlords think in hard numbers, right? They want to see what your objective is in a dollar amount. I understand what you asked me, Scott, and it's a case-by-case basis, as we all know. And sure, some landlords are abating rent for a certain percentage of the amount of base rent. I should point out that operating expenses, tenants should expect to pay operating expenses, whether it's a deferment or an abatement, over this entire stretch of time. So the negotiation is in the base rental rate. And I've seen the success that I've seen has been in deferring rent more so than the abatement.
Although so when it's deferred, though, is it deferred for if they've got 5 years left on their lease? Is it in 1/60th chunks for the balance of their lease, or is it over a shorter period of time, say 12 months? What have you seen?
Okay, I've seen. Well, there's the formulas have been case by case again. I've seen it amortized over the remainder of the lease term under a deferment, so over and on top of the existing base rental rate. But I've also seen there be a point where there's a trigger where the landlord is requesting and the tenant submits financials over quarterly, and if they achieve a threshold, then they need to pay it all back at that point. And then some of them are actually, some of the workouts are charging interest on the deferment. And so that's another option as far as negotiating what we're dealing with here. As far as the abatement goes, the most simple solution I've seen as far as an abatement goes is just extending the lease term out. So for example, you have 10 months left on your lease term. The landlord is asking for an additional 6 months because he's giving you 2 months of base rent abatement. That's the trade-off. And then at the end of the primary lease term, when this amendment takes place, the lease rate bumps on a basis based on perhaps the previous annual bumps. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And it's probably a really good segue to really introduce Jason Cruz, who's the managing broker of the Colorado Group, and let him talk a little bit more from the landlord's perspective, because not only is he a broker, but he's also an owner. So he can give a little bit of an insight and some of the things that might help a tenant formulate the best way to come forward with a request, understanding how the landlord has to think of it, because they have other considerations. They're a lender that is part of the decision, or can be in some instances. So, and Jason, so I don't steal your thunder, why don't I turn it over to you and let you make some general comments about the landlord's perspective, and then we can kind of tie this all together with regard to what's the fairest way to approach these conversations and how best to be prepared. So Jason?
Okay, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Ashley. I've been with the Colorado Group since 1999 and been practicing in Boulder County since 1994. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I think today is the first day I've actually dressed in normal clothes before noon, so thank you for that. What landlords should be considering in this environment is, like Ashley mentioned, it's a lot of communication. landlords need to get on the phone or get on their email, talk to their tenants, talk to their lenders, talk to other landlords, of course, talk to their attorneys. And then so they can get a sense of what's going on in the marketplace, they talk to brokers. Let me give you one example of what we've seen a lender do. We had a lender defer mortgage payments for 3 months. And the way that worked is the payment in the 4th month did not change. It's just that more of that payment was applied to the interest rather than the principal. So it's a good tool that a landlord can use to store up some cash to help the tenants that need help. In terms of action steps and what I'm seeing some landlords do, the biggest one right now is the cleanliness of buildings. And I think going forward, landlords are going to have to install some things like hand sanitizing stations. Certainly cleaning properties and empty spaces is going to be a big issue so that brokers and prospective tenants can see the spaces without having much of a concern. But it remains to be seen how all of this will roll out based upon how COVID will affect properties. It's just important to note that there's going to be changes in the way landlords have to treat their buildings. In terms of what landlords are doing right now, a lot of them are reducing services. Certainly, you don't have the trash needing to be picked up as much as you did a month ago or a month and a half ago. Any service that is not essential, no pun intended, but window washing, snow removal, it'll melt probably tomorrow. But any service that's not required, landlords are not doing so that they can help save their tenants money on their triple net expenses. The biggest one of those triple nets is always the taxes. And what I think landlords need to consider right now is how COVID is affecting the property values, because it definitely has an effect. And so when it comes time to assess the property, you can demonstrate to the assessor that you had, let's say, 5 retail tenants and none of them were operating for a month or 2 months. Your building value went down and your taxes should go down congruently. So that's what landlords should be doing, is making sure that they're documenting properly what effect this is having on their cash flow. As Ashley mentioned, you need to have your attorney draft all appropriate forms, whether it's a loan modification or a lease addendum as well. And what I've experienced from the attorneys is that this is all brand new to them as well. So they're kind of struggling to put these forms together, but they are getting done because it's, we're all in the same boat in this urgent situation. The other thing that I heard on a conference call yesterday was that force majeure in my tenure has never really been an issue in leases, but going forward, it's going to be an absolute must. So you want to have your attorney in all of your future leases prepare a good force majeure language. If you want to flip to the next slide there. The commercial real estate market relies heavily on employment. And I thought this was a really good depiction of where we've been and where we're going. As you can see, the unemployment rate right now, according to this graph, is about 6.1%. I think that's probably a little conservative. We're going to be higher than that, probably into the double digits. But what's important to note is how quickly we get back to relatively low unemployment. Once this COVID passes, companies will rehire those people that were furloughed, and we will get back to low unemployment. That's what's forecasted anyway. So if that comes to fruition, it's a good sign for landlords. And then the next one. So I just took a little beat off an old Bob Marley song, and just every little thing is gonna be all right. I know this is a hard time right now, but there's a lot of pent-up demand, especially in retail, which is struggling the most. You know, people have a desire to go out to bars. They have a desire to be around other people in restaurants and socialize. They have a desire to shop and buy things. So once this storm passes, I think that you'll see people return to those habits. It might not be in the same fashion that we had before COVID, but it's not going to totally disappear. So obviously, I'm encouraging everyone to support their local retailers right now. And then when this passes, we need to make an effort as a society to return to our normal ways as much as we can. The economic stimulus package is pretty substantial. And the effects that it's going to have, we're not seeing right now, but I think down the road, you're going to be surprised of how positive this stimulus package is and people spending money. The other saving grace is that interest rates are incredibly low. I heard that residential mortgage rates may decline to the point of 2.5%. Commercial rates are going to be higher than that, but still, it's an incredible time to be borrowing money if you're a commercial landlord or restructuring your loan. So there's a lot of that went on before COVID, and I think that it's going to be even more prevalent after this all comes to pass. So definitely be in contact with your lender or other lenders and see what they can offer. And then finally, as Ashley mentioned, there's lights at the end of the tunnel. There's going to be hiring, and it's going to be in certain sectors, such as the public sector. Defense is going to be a big one, tech labs, and intellectual property companies. So hang in there. Everything's going to be okay.
And Jason, specific to the chart that you had up, was that Boulder County? Was that statewide? Was that national? I know, and it also is unfortunately already dated because we are starting to approach double digits. But I think the point of the graph was really to show how quickly the recovery, which was the point you made, and I've heard it referred to as the U-shape recovery, where we're going to go into it really quickly, and most likely by third, fourth quarter this year, we should be back to single digits. That's what Rich Wobekine at the University of Colorado, who's a great economist that everyone leans on, that's what he actually reported today in an earlier presentation. But back to the specific question, Jason, that chart was national, state, or county?
Yeah, that's a national chart. And because we're in Boulder County, I think it's going to be even more impactful. In other words, I think we're going to recover quicker than the rest of the country because of the tight environment that we're in for jobs before COVID. I think we're going to recover even quicker. So, but that was a national chart.
Right, and I think there's some conversation that's happening out there that because of our composition, like you were starting to hint towards, the type of users, if the majority of it is really tech oriented, a lot of that can be work from home. And as we turn back on the stay at home order and we start to more integrate back into a normal work environment, that will allow businesses to actually be more productive sooner than others that rely solely on you have to be there making the widget next to someone. So I think Boulder County has an advantage over everyone. Before we go on to kind of looking to the future with Joe, let's stick with the landlord-tenant relationship. And Jason, can you share a couple of examples of stories that you've been presented from a landlord's perspective, or you've seen presented by a client of yours to a landlord that got traction, and then ones that didn't? Because I think the learning curve here is going back to what Ashley said, which is the tenant has to be prepared. And because he has to convince the landlord what he's presented them is fair. So can you give an example that comes to mind with regard to an overzealous request that was kind of rejected, and maybe a more appropriate, fair request that was presented and it was accepted?
Yeah, and I agree with what Ashley said. I think deferral is winning the day right now. I don't see many landlords abating rent unless it's very specific to retail or hospitality. But at the beginning of this, we had a couple tenants come to us and were immediately requesting rent relief within the first 2 or 3 days. And they didn't really have any justification. We didn't know what the government programs were going to be. they weren't providing any of their financials. And so those are typically the ones that have failed. The ones
So
that were, oh, go ahead.
yeah, sorry to interrupt. So asks that are more emotional based,
Yes.
they can't be really digested and responded to appropriately. So it usually comes with a, that's not the answer. I don't know what it is yet. We're going to have to pause this conversation until more data. Is that a fair assessment of how that goes?
Yeah, I think so. It's, you know, as Ashley mentioned, you got to have a story. You just can't ask just to ask.
Right. And so that would mean projections of what you think or how your business has been impacted. And many retailers that might be on this phone call know that they have in a lot of leases, there's a responsibility to report your sales. So you can't make up a story and then have it not come to fruition, because we had an example of that where a sandwich company came forward and said, we need 90 days of free rent right now, or otherwise we're going to fail. And we tried to approach it by saying, everyone take a deep breath. We'll help you, but we need to know how to help you. And when their first month's numbers actually came in, March's numbers, which were the first half was normal business and the second half wasn't, they were impacted, absolutely. But it was more like 50 cents on the dollar. That was specific to their model. Now there's other businesses that are on this call that they had to turn their revenue off 100%. So they have a real compelling story. I have no revenue, how do I pay my bills? But if we as the landlord had granted that 90 days of abatement or 90 days of deferral, whatever form it took, what happens if the PPP loan does fund? Because one of the requirements is you must spend it on your 75% of it on your salaries to your employees and the rest of it to rent or utilities. If you don't spend it, it isn't forgivable. So you need to really lean on your CPA about coaching how to use the funds once you get them, because it should include most likely paying some rent. In fact, we had a tenant come to us early in the game and said, hey, we need 3 months of abatement. We'll pay it back. We'll pay it back in 1/12 increments over the following year. However, we need that. And the landlord granted it. But then they came back 2 weeks later and said, we've got a PPP loan. We've got to pay you. So I think the lesson learned there is if you can get a relationship established between the landlord and a tenant that they know they're going to work together, but they both have to acknowledge they may not have all the facts as to what is to come up with the appropriate solution. Ashley, Jason, would you say that's a fair assessment?
A lot of moving parts,
Right.
a lot of unknowns.
Right. I'm going to take one question before we let Joe have the floor here and talk about the future. There was a question about restrictions on showings. How are subleasings being handled now? And so it's kind of a multi-part question, and how can new tenants move into existing spaces that tenants haven't vacated? Well, let's take those one at a time. Showing restrictions. So it's flip-flopped with regard to the Attorney General and what they have actually represented to the brokerage community. They first came out and said all services are within the essential services. Then they made a point of clarification where it's only specific to transactions that are essentially at the closing table. And anything else with regard to showings and open houses are strictly prohibited. So we as brokers should be, and brokerage houses should have policies in place that frankly need to honor that through the expiration date, which is towards the end of this month. However, I do think that landlords that want to show something or a tenant wants to see something, you could theoretically introduce them as parties and they could coordinate something. But again, they have to look at themselves. Are they an essential business and should they be doing these behaviors? Our job as brokers is not to be the police, but to abide by the rules that we have to adhere to. So I think unfortunately the reality is that we're leaning on virtual tours, hiring videographers to take pictures of the inside of things so we can then share that virtually and people can go through the experience of seeing the spaces if they were standing there. So I think that's kind of how showings have to be handled right now until the Attorney General makes a different determination. How are subleases being handled? It's the same thing. If the question was based on how are you showing these properties, it does bring another wrinkle into it, and you should consult your attorney, which is when showings are allowed. COVID-19 has not disappeared. you're still going to have the risk of disclosing to the incoming touring tenant that this is an inhabited space and that there is no warranty or rep that the COVID is not in existence in this space, and to take appropriate precautions, whatever the CDC at that time tells us we need to do. So, and you also have to ask the subleasing tenant or the tenant that's leaving if it's also acceptable to tour their space and what are their rules of engagement. So there's another level of coordination that brokers will need to do on behalf of their tenants to make sure that they all, one, understand, are and as safe as possible. And if a tenant is currently in a space, tenant's currently in a space. So I'm not exactly sure how to dissect or clarify that question. So with that, why don't we kind of put the tenant landlord conversation on the shelf for a second and then sort of transition over to Joe, let him talk a little bit about forward thinking, and then we all three can make some comments to that. Then we'll come back and address some questions. So Joe?
Right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Bunnell. I've been with the Colorado Group since January of this year. I've been in real estate since 2004, serving the commercial and residential markets. And today I'm going to talk real quick about vacancy rates, lease rates in the future, short-term lending impacts, getting back to work in the short term, space requirements over the long term, technology of buildings looking forward, and some opportunities that may present themselves in our market moving forward. So to jump right into it, I'm going to be talking about specifically 4 lease properties in our retail and office sectors. So in Longmont, we have a little bit more than 1.25 million square feet of retail space. That's the inventory that's tracked by CoStar. At the end of 2019, we had a little more than 221,000 square feet available for a vacancy factor of 17.6%. And year to date, we have a little more than 245,000 square feet available. So a small increase from last year, year end to current, about 2% in vacancy, which brings us up around 19.5% right now. So for the near term, I think while tenants and employers are taking advantage of the funds available through the CARES Act by way of PPP and EIDL loans, and working out short-term lease arrangements with their landlords, it's reasonable to believe that this vacancy factor is going to remain stable for the next 90 to 100 days. There's no question that the retail sector has been hit the hardest through this COVID pandemic, and it's going to take a little bit more time to really gauge the long-term impact. But as our retailers, restaurants, gyms, and personal services start to open back up, and we establish a new normal for the way that we do business, it's a little difficult to predict how soon consumer confidence will be at pre-pandemic levels. So I do see the vacancy rate increasing in Q3 and Q4 of this year, but not by a tremendous amount. I would say we could see another 5 to 7% of available retail space come available by the end of this year. In the office sector, we have about 965,000 square feet of leasable space. Right now, we actually have a little bit of a higher vacancy factor in that sector, and it's been increasing since the end of 2017. At the end of 2019, we had a vacancy factor of 27.2% with about 262,000 square feet of available office space. Year to date, we have about 288,000 square feet of available office space. So that's ticked up a little bit even since the end of the year. And right now we're sitting at a vacancy rate of about 30%. Office users have also, as you know, been impacted, I mean, somewhat to a lesser degree than retail users because they can bring their employees home and they can have people work remotely. But that still doesn't negate the fact that we were already at a higher vacancy rate. And so for the short term, I see that, the office sector is going to remain stable for the remainder of this year with some lagging impacts that will surface in Q1, Q2 next year. So that leads me into, kind of talk about the lease rates. So, right now the retail average lease rate for spaces available in Longmont is averaging right around $19 a square foot on the base rent. And I'm not going to go into the triple net rates as those, they vary tremendously by location. and what's included in the CAMs and everything else. So, you know, the issue with that is, you know, an increase in vacancies will also start to slow down the absorption rate of available inventory. So we'll likely see some competitive rates for the retail sector in the near future. Probably not for the remainder of this year, but I would say, you know, first part of next year. I haven't found any current model to really predict where that could land, but I speculate that we'll see discounts in the, you know, probably the 10 to 15% range from today's date. It's not, you know, as bad as it was, say 2008, but more comparable to 2015, 2016 base rates is what I'm predicting. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but based on the projections for more space that's going to become available onto the market, it's certainly going to slow down the absorption rate and spur on some competition. Lease rates for office space have been averaging between $24 and $25 a square foot on the base. And like I was talking about just a moment ago, the pre-pandemic vacancy factor has been ticking up since mid-2017. So with a little bit more anticipated increase to that vacancy factor as a result of this COVID, it's likely that we'll see somewhat of an adjustment to the base rates as a discount as well. So I'm thinking somewhere between the 7 and 10% off of that base rate. And that's going to need to happen so we can begin filling these spaces. We have a lot of beautiful office space in Longmont that needs to be filled. So go ahead.
Joe, do you think the recovery efforts, obviously you're suggesting, and I think it's rational, that the data shows and the trends and our experience shows that the lease rates are going to have to soften a little bit to complete that. But one of the things that we experienced for landlords and tenants, both sides, through some of these other recessionary type events, are that the rate, you can advertise it or ask for as aggressively as you want, but if there isn't a need or an availability, transactions won't happen. And I think it starts to come back to when tenants finally figure out what they want to become. So would it be fair to say there's going to be some pause in the market for some period of time while tenants and landlords figure out who they are, so they know how to go forward? I
would absolutely agree with that. I think, you know, it's going to take a little bit to figure out what is the new normal moving forward and how are we going to handle these, our business, and what kind of spaces do we need? How much of it do we need? You know, what does that setup look like for us? So right. I think absolutely there's going to be some pause in the marketplace for further evaluation for every individual business owner.
Right. Well, thanks for kind of the rundown. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Do you have some more comments?
Yeah, I was just going to talk about as far as short-term lending impacts. So right now, the lending rates, as you previously mentioned, on the residential side, they're getting down below that 3% point. SBA loans are also in the low 3s and high 2s, depending on your term. So there's certain banks that are putting more scrutiny on their borrowers, and they're certainly backlogged right now as a result of all the influx of the PPP apps. So it's reasonable to assume that, and has been stated to me by some local lenders, that they are going to experience delays in the normal course of their lending routines and business models. So some banks are going to be putting more scrutiny on their borrowers moving forward. Some of them are going to chalk this up to nobody's fault. You know, like we're talking about the force majeure type situation of the experience that everybody's having right now. And if it's a one-time circumstance, they're going to overlook that part of it, and they're open for business and willing to lend. So we do have some really solid local lenders that are here to support our community and business owners through this, which is really awesome. And then I don't know if you wanted me to talk about some of the other, you know, conceptual ideas for space looking forward into the long term, or not, but there's certainly some pretty cool ideas coming down the road as to what, you know, the future of real estate looks like in commercial office space. So
yeah, please share.
So you know, when space planners and architects are talking about building out of the space, you know, they're looking for the highest and best use of space. And we've been in a higher density type office situation for the last several years, with average square footage per employee of around 150 square feet, and that's probably going to have to increase. So we're talking increasing the square footage per employee by another 50 to 100 or 100 square feet per employee, setting up the space so that there's more of a natural traffic flow in it, so that people aren't in the same space at the same time, creating more hard lines for social distancing, and some of the technological advances that we've been seeing over the years, such as biometrics, facial recognition, and eyeball scanning, or whatever you call that, retina scanners, as far as remote access and touchless entry for credentialing people into a building. Those could become more commonplace. That, in addition to higher quality air filtration and sanitizing techniques, meaning more janitorial, or implementing things such as robotics that run through an office space with a UV sanitizing light on them to help control any sort of viral outbreak that may exist in an office and help people stay protected. So that's kind of cool. Some of those things that could stem out of this, it would certainly present some opportunities for new business creation and reuse of spaces that may have been vacated otherwise.
Right. A real world example of what you were just describing, we were working with a tenant that thought that they were going to be as much as a 50,000 square foot user, and they're now currently 30,000. And through this, they've learned a couple of things about themselves, that playbook has sort of been thrown in the trash can. And now that they've sort of, first, as you all as business owners out there have triaged your business, either from a landlord or a tenant, meaning where am I cash flow wise? What does my balance sheet look like? What's my projected revenue based on how I can conduct business? And you've sort of taken a state of the union. And I think that step has occurred as of a couple of weeks ago. Then it went into implementing solutions, which is what we're talking about today, which is start the conversation with your landlords and or submit for some government assistance programs. And then how does that work? And I think part of the ecosystem includes lenders. And those lenders have been inundated with having to try to process these PPP loans. So a couple of questions have come through about, well, are lenders lending? And I think, Joe, to your point, they are, but they can't get to your file yet because they're so swamped with literally working sunrise to sunset to try to get these things processed for their clients. So I think those kinds of conversations will happen in this next phase, which then gets us into the planning phase, which is what does happen to us tomorrow. So I think that's really the process that we're seeing each of our clients go through right now. They were in triage, they're then into formulation, now they're into implementation, and maybe even back to formalization because they're learning something through this whole process. That tenant that I started to describe realized that a lot of their employees could work from home. So why would they pay for more square footage or take on more square footage? But they might still have to take on more square footage because their density, to what you had mentioned, Joe, has changed.
Right.
They once were 150 square feet per tenant. Now they're going to have to be 250 square feet per tenant, and maybe even work in shifts where they can keep that 6 to 10 foot distancing. And there's even been the conversation about going to plans that have more hard wall offices, like what we all experienced in the 80s, where everything was an office. Where we went to this open concept and cubicles. Well, that may not be safe. So no one has the right answer. It's just, I think the process, everyone's peers are going through that right now, is trying to figure out what's next. Right. But I think to Jason and Ashley's comments about landlord and tenant representation, or tenants' expectations in these, it's having an open, honest conversation about where you are and what you need to survive. Because the last thing, as Jason was pointing out, is landlords don't want vacancies. They have certain requirements in their loan that require that their buildings stay at a certain occupancy level and income level, and so they want to work out solutions. I think the other takeaway I heard from both of you was the idea that when you come to the table asking for something, you also might want to think about, and this is from the tenant's perspective, what can I give the landlord to have fairness in this request? You know, if you had 2 years left on your lease and you like the space and you believe you can operate successfully in it going forward, offer a 3-year extension for 2 months free up front. Those are all things that are conversations that are being had. So not to dominate the comments, but open it up to Joe or Jason or Ashley to any other real world examples of what we're seeing out there in tenant, because I think that's the meat and potatoes of what everyone in the audience really wants to hear, which is what should I be asking for and what's reasonable and how do I do it? And I think we've touched on that, but I don't know if any of you have anything that you'd like to emphasize on that subject.
I would definitely reach out to your lenders. I mean, they are inundated right now, but they are willing to help. So things will take a little bit of time, and all the local lenders here in town are willing to help.
And I think there's a reason for that, because I think the federal government is supporting them, letting them know that they should and can and need to continue to be in business and that they will figure it out. So they're being subsidized as well. So there isn't a reason why banks should turn off, except for there's just not enough hours in the day to do all the work that's being required of every transaction that's being asked of them. So I think we also have to have patience as a borrower or a client of the bank. That would be the other thing that I see happening. And patience is hard.
Yeah, absolutely. You need money now. Waiting is hard.
Right. And I'm kind of going through the laundry list of questions to see if we've already covered them. Here's a good one. And I don't know if any of us have an exact answer, but I think we can get through it, which is, does COVID language need to now be existing in leases? Jason, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but I can say for sure that you're going to be seeing attorneys draft several different provisions, whether it's for COVID or some other pandemic. And like we talked about before, force majeure is going to be at the top of everyone's list. But I can imagine, tenants wanting some type of warranty that the space they're moving into has been sanitized or cleaned. And there's going to be requests from tenants that probably we haven't even, thought about yet. So I think there'll definitely be some changes in some leases, and we'll just have to see what tenants are requesting and how much landlords are willing to bend to those requirements.
Right. A couple more questions. Someone asked the question that there's a rumor going on that is the federal government going to eliminate capital gains for property owners for a limited time. And obviously to create a capital gains, you've got to sell something. You got to sell it at a profit. So there's a capital gains event that had occurred. So assuming that is the set of facts, then the question is, do I have to pay taxes? And the answer is, as it currently stands, to the best of our knowledge, absolutely you do. However, one thing that has been accomplished as a legislature just in the last few days, it's my understanding, is that a deferral. If you're in a 1031 exchange, which isn't directly to this question because a capital gains event has been realized, you have to purposely go into a tax-free exchange process. And in that process allows for certain timeframes. You have 45 days to identify a replacement property under certain rules. Then you have 180 days to close that from the time you originally closed it into the new property. So they're suggesting that if either of those two deadlines fall between earlier this year and July 15th, you have all the way until July 15th in order to complete your transaction. So if you don't, you still owe the capital gains. So there isn't anything that I've heard of, unless any of the rest of you have, that's specific to capital gains. Now, there may be some talks, but there's nothing that's been enacted. Is that everyone else's recollection?
That's what I've read as well.
Okay. Question was asked, I think, from more of a landlord's perspective, are there incentive packages for non-employee based programs? Ashley, I don't know if you want to touch on that. If not, I'm happy to cover it.
What's the question again, Scott?
The question is, if I am a entity or a person that doesn't have any employees, are there any governmental incentive plans?
Well, there were.
Yeah.
If you were an independent contractor or self-employed, yeah, the PPP was open to you.
So originally the PPP was specific to incorporated entities. And
well,
then
it's always been open to individuals as well.
That started on the 10th of April.
Correct.
the
There was different-
applications came later, or at least when they opened the door for applications for those borrowers.
I think the unfortunate event of that timing delay between incorporated entities and sole proprietors, the incorporated entities gobbled up all the money. And unfortunately, those that were sole proprietors had to get in line. And where they are in line, unfortunately, looks like they're going to be, under this first legislative act, going to be put on pause and not funded. Now, I think thus far our government seems to have done a fairly good job of acting fairly quickly and injecting capital into our ecosystem. And I am going to guess that it's reasonable to assume that they're going to have to dig deeper in their pockets and replenish the available cash to help support this. That's no guarantee, but I think a rational person can conclude that they're going to have to bolster these programs in order to allow for more businesses to take advantage of what the original businesses that were standing first in line. So that would be my guess, but just one person's opinion.
So the other thing too, Scott, is that the unemployment office has opened up unemployment claims to sole proprietors as well. So if somebody's out of work right now, they can qualify for unemployment benefits through the state.
All right, I'm looking at the next round of questions to see if there's something we can jump on here. We are approaching our 1 hour timeline. So here in a minute or so, we'll kind of wrap it up formally, but anyone that wants to stay, if there's some more questions, we certainly can continue the question and answer dialogue for a few more minutes after that. I haven't seen any additional questions that, at least at this time, we haven't touched on in some form or fashion. I don't know if any of the three of you have any closing remarks.
I'll throw something out there as far as leases that were executed recently and whether or not they're in the stages of tenant improvements or coming up on commencement date. So an interesting deal point that got thrown into the mix on me here recently was what we're calling a circulation multiplier. So what that means, it's office space, open office environment, and the tenant is saying, well, we have to set social distancing or follow those requirements, that being 6 feet from one another. So they're actually setting up the desks 6 feet apart. And what they negotiated successfully is that during a period of time where the desks have to be at this higher circulation factor, the rent comes down by that percentage. So when hopefully the lift on social distancing occurs, the desks go back together and the rent goes back to normal.
Okay, Jason or Joe, any other final comments?
No, I'd like to just let anybody know if you've got questions. I'm here to help if you'd like to give me a call privately, offline.
Yeah, Amanda, if you can go to the last slide, there's our contact information. If you have any specific follow-up questions you'd like any of us to try to address for you or point you in the right direction, because I think the takeaway is really need to lean on your CPA, your attorney, and your brokers to give you all of the data points you need to try to make the best determination. I think the real takeaway from our conversation is try to find fairness in the conversation and be clear what you're asking. So you can enter the conversation and have the other side of the conversation understand what you're asking for and why, so you can look to a win-win for both sides of the equation. So again, thank you to the Chamber and organizing this through the business organizations to get the number of participants that joined on today's call. I wanted to thank Joe and Jason and Ashley for their time and their thoughts. And as they've all said, there is light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to find it. And I think we're all working together in a way that really is going to help us all find the solution. So hang in there and reach out to those professionals. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you guys all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.